If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Following the Battle of Globe Tavern, the Union still held on to the Weldon Railroad, which helped prevent supplies from getting into Petersburg and Richmond. Ulysses S. Grant wanted to wreck more of the railroad, but realized that the 5th Corps under Gouverneur K. Warren was devastated after the Battle of Globe Tavern. However, Grant didn't hear about the devastation of the Corps from its leader, but Richmond newspapers. When he read about the over 2,500 prisoners taken by the Confederates, Grant realized the Corps had been hit much harder than expected, so he needed to find other troops to help destroy the railroad. He thought first of using the 18th Corps, but they were weakened by sickness and had been in the trenches for months now. He and George Meade had already moved the 9th Corps and the 2nd Corps troops toward Warren's position at Globe Tavern, so it was determined to send the rest of the 2nd Corps south of the Globe Tavern to Reams Station to continue to wreck the railroad. A battle had already took place at Reams Station at the end of June. It ended the raid of Union Cavalry Commander James Wilson. It was a horrible defeat for Wilson and the Union. Now the 2nd Corps would move down the Jerusalem Plank Road, then head west to Reams Station, just below Warren, where Union cavalry held the area. The 2nd Corps, led by Union Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, was an odd choice for use for the assignment. It was the most dependable of the Union Corps in the Army of the Potomac, but that is exactly why its numbers were down. Grant and Meade used Hancock's corps extensively during the Overland Campaign and during the Siege of Petersburg. The casualties from so much combat resulted in those men being replaced with green troops. So even if the Corps possessed the numbers to combat the Confederates, the men were inexperienced, something Hancock complained about during this time. His troops were happy to get out of the trenches. By daylight, we found ourselves in the midst of a country which had not been much desolated by the march of war. Through this we passed cheerily along amid apple trees laden with fruit and cornfields whose ears were just ready for roasting. Hancock made a fatal error when occupying Reams Station. Previous occupations resulted in small entrenchments being built, but nowhere near what was needed. Hancock chose not to improve the fortifications. Confederate cavalry under Wade Hampton watched the position carefully, and Hampton himself reported to Robert E. Lee that he feared the hold on the Weldon Railroad would eventually threaten the supplies coming in from the west. Instead of bolstering the protection of the wagon trains to the west, Lee decided to attack Hancock for political reasons. As the November election neared, any victory against Grant would work in favor of the Confederates upon the minds of the Northern populace. Lee wagered that if he could drive Hancock from the railroad, then he would score a victory politically against Lincoln. For this attack, Lee nearly stripped all of his entrenchments around Petersburg of troops, including some newly arrived brigades from Charles Field's division. A.P. Hill, with division commanders Cadmus Wilcox and Henry Heath, would launch an attack against Hancock in conjunction with a feint on the Army's left. George Pickett, commanding troops on the Howlett Line at Bermuda Hundred, and Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard, just across the Appomattox River in Petersburg, would exchange false signals to make Grant and Meade think a major attack was coming at Bermuda Hundred. At 1 p.m., Hill gave the orders for his troops to begin a movement west and south, avoiding Warren's troops at Globe Tavern in order to strike at Reams Station. By 3 or 4 p.m., Hill's men were on their way out of the Petersburg entrenchments, traveling by a multitude of roads. Hill's men proceeded south and camped not too far from Reams Station on the night of August 24th. On the morning of August 25th, Hancock nervously examined his surroundings. Reports came in that a large Confederate force marched his way, but after repeated reconnaissance, no evidence of the report could be found. Hill's men were having to move cross-country to get to Reams Station. They had already marched about 10 miles the previous day, but were still a few miles from the enemy. They planned to attack early that morning, but delays pushed that plan back. Although it was working against the Confederates' plan, this lured Hancock into a false sense of security. The rebel cavalry attacked first, driving up from the south. The horsemen pushed back the Union skirmishers and caused such a disturbance that Hancock was forced to advance some of his infantry. One Union soldier remembered, We were close enough to the enemy to hear their guns snap and hear the officers giving their commands. Captain F.M. Acton and the rider lay low among the corn, as close to the ground as we could lie, the corn stalks near and around us being cut off by the bullets of the enemy, as though knives were cutting them, the balls striking in the sand through it in our faces. Hampton's cavalry couldn't handle the situation with more Union infantry being deployed, so he sent word to Hill to find out why he wasn't attacking. Hill told him about the delay and then instructed Hampton to draw the Federals away from Reams Station so the Southern infantry could hit them in the rear as they went after the cavalry. Hampton implemented this new plan, engaging with the Federal infantry, then pulling back. John Gibbon, the division commander of the infantry that engaged with Hampton's troops, ordered his brigades to advance down the railroad to determine how large of a force opposed them. The push south resulted in Hancock gaining prisoners that informed him that Hill was going to most likely attack that day, and soon. Hancock pulled Gibbon's men back to the main line and told his men to prepare for battle. A Union artilleryman in the earthworks remembered that he heard some musketry in his front and then immediately saw Union horsemen running toward him, raising a great dust and riding as recklessly as if the whole rebel army was at their heels. The Second Battle of Reams Station was beginning to erupt. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. A.P. Hill moved 2 of his divisions, with additional troops from other commands, to Reams Station. Cadmus Wilcox pushed his brigade toward Reams Station, sending the Union skirmishers into the Federal entrenchments in a panic. The chaotic sounds coming from the west convinced Hancock to move Horace P. Rugg's brigade from its position on the left of Matthew Murphy's brigade to a supporting position behind Levin Crandall's brigade of New Yorkers. He also recalled Thomas Smith's brigade back to the earthworks. Wilcox's skirmishers had pushed in Hancock's skirmishers, but the Union general wanted the line re-established and ordered an extended skirmish line thrown out. It overlapped the Confederate line in places, but didn't stay at the front long. The weight of the Confederate attack sent the skirmishers back into the fortifications. Wilcox's corps commander, A.P. Hill, was suffering from prostatitis, and it was particularly bad on this hot August day. Hill was forced to dismount from his horse and lay on the ground because of the incredible amount of pain. Because of this, Wilcox exercised a sort of independent command. Wilcox deemed it necessary to press the Union forces after observing so many of them running from his troops. He thought he couldn't wait for Henry Heath's division to make it to the field, so he sent George Anderson and Alfred Scales' brigades in a charge against the Federal works, but Anderson's men got to within 200 yards, received some artillery and light musketry, hitting many officers, and they fell back. Anderson's men, falling back, caused a chain reaction, sending Scales' men back as well. Wilcox was determined to make another assault, using the unused brigades of his division. Wilcox would need to bring Samuel McGowan's brigade north, but expose them to enemy fire to do so. But with Heath's division arriving on the field, Wilcox decided to call off another attack until Heath was ready to assault the Federal position. Wilcox's sharpshooters began their work of destruction as the battle entered a lull. Here deliberately, but without malice, planning the destruction of their enemies, the sharpshooters carefully estimated the distance between the lines, the depression of the ground where the enemy lay, the course the ball would take in its trajectory flight, and the exact point where it would cut the line of fire. Then, adjusting their sights accordingly, they entered upon the work at hand. A Union artillerist remembered the havoc rebel sharpshooters played on their position. Standing out in bold relief above the slight earthwork in teams of 6, they were naturally a prominent target for rebel bullets, and the peculiar dull thud of these, at short intervals, told either that another animal had fallen a victim to the enemy's fire or, what was frequently the case, that one already hit was further wounded. Some of the horses would fall when struck by the first bullet, lie quiet a while, then struggle to their feet again to receive additional injuries. They were certainly thoroughly riddled, and long before the serious fighting of the day occurred, but 2 out of the 30 plainly visible to the enemy were left standing. These 2 had been struck, but not vitally, and survived some time longer. This statement does not include the horses on the caissons, most of which also fell. Army of the Potomac commander George Meade ventured to the front and heard disturbing news to himself. Reports came in that Lee had stripped his main Petersburg line of troops to strengthen forces going to attack Hancock and to aid other locations. The rebel defenses around Petersburg were paper thin. Barely a skirmish line separated the Army of the Potomac from the city. Meade heard the news and immediately became concerned about Hancock. The Army commander directed the Army's reserves to Globe Tavern, Reams Station, and points south on the Jerusalem Plank Road to protect the Union rear. The normally aggressive Ulysses S. Grant didn't visit the front that day because he suffered from an illness. Some historians speculate that he may have pushed Meade to attack the Petersburg defenses instead of using the Army's reserves to bolster other areas. When A.P. Hill heard about the feebleness of Wilcox's first attack, he got up from his prone state and was prepared to withdraw from Reams Station. When Heath's division came up, Heath, Hill, and Wilcox discussed further actions. Heath said that if William McRae and John R. Cook's brigades were supported by Wilcox's division, they could carry the position. Hill then agreed to renew the attack. Hill, Heath, and Wilcox formed their battle line, with James Connor's brigade and Cook's brigade in front, Scales' brigade to the rear and left of Connor, and McRae to the rear and right of Cook. Sammy McGowan and George Anderson occupied the right, guarding the flank. The entire formation of the new battle line took a couple of hours. The plan devised by Hill and Wade Hampton the previous evening had failed, primarily due to the time required for the tired secessionist infantry to reach the field. Now the Southerners abandoned subtlety and staked everything on a frontal assault. The new plan of attack simply called for the infantry to advance on the works after an artillery barrage. No time remained for further maneuvering or for another assault if this one failed. Hancock used his time wisely as well. Smith's brigade was on its way back to the Union line. Union cavalry covered the area south of Hancock's position, and another portion of cavalry extended Smith's line to the east. Heath and Wilcox met with their well-respected and talented artillery commander, William Pegram, to inform him of his duties that day. Pegram was born in Richmond, Virginia, and was attending the University of Virginia to study law when the war broke out. Despite his nearsightedness, Pegram became an artilleryman lauded by many Confederate generals. He fought viciously and commanded his cannons with precision to do as much damage to the enemy as possible. The three men synchronized their watches and planned for a 5 p.m. assault. At 5 p.m. on August 25th, William Pegram's 17 artillery pieces let loose a barrage of case shot and shell into the blue lines. Distinct among the rebel guns was a Whitworth gun. The man who hears the scream of a Whitworth shell will never forget the sound to the day of his death. It is a concentration of the war whoop of an Indian, the snarl of a tiger, and the scream of a woman in mortal terror. It begins afar off with a muttered threat of vengeance. It grows upon the ear with a howl as of wolves in pursuit of the lone traveler. It comes nearer with shrieks of baffled rage. It is at hand with a scream which can be likened to nothing but the cries of a mob mad for death and destruction. After about 15 minutes of the artillery doing their work, the brigades of James Connor and John R. Cook stepped off toward the enemy. They held their fire, wanting to get close before exchanging volleys. The North Carolinians closed in on the Federal works, and some hand-to-hand fighting broke out. William McRae could hear the battle raging and knew that Connor and Cook were drawing the enemy's fire, and it was his time to go in. He declared to his men, "Every man must yell as if he were a division in himself. Dash for the enemy's works, and not fire until there." The right two regiments of Cook's line failed to go forward when the rest of the brigade did, but when McRae marched toward the enemy, those two regiments joined them, encountering the enemy first. Artillery fire devastated the two regiments, and many were pushed back, but McRae's brigade pushed those men onward and gained a lodgment on the enemy position. The Union line was beginning to crumble as new recruits, unused to combat, began to run for their lives. McRae pushed his men southward and started to roll up the Federal regiments, but got stopped by a resurgence of Union resistance. To the north, troops under Connor and Cook had been stopped and were about to surrender when they heard and saw McRae's progress. Connor reformed his men and knocked another hole in the Union line. Levin Crandall's brigade was in a desperate situation. Both its right and left flank had caved in, and now the Confederates were working their way into the Union rear. Many of Crandall's brigade surrendered to the overwhelming gray tide. The heavy smoke obscured the battlefield, and Henry Heath and Cadmus Wilcox couldn't tell what was going on, but assumed the attack had failed. They sent a courier into the fray to see what was happening, and word came back that the attack had been a huge success, with prisoners headed their way. Wilcox rode off to see for himself, and Heath ordered in David Weisiger's brigade, part of Samuel McGowan's brigade, and Joseph King's brigade. King's troops were formerly under John C.C. Sanders, who was killed a few days before at the Battle of Globe Tavern. Inside the Union fortifications was pure chaos. I at once shouted to the men, "Fire and get out quick," and suited the action to the command by setting such an example of racing and hurdle jumping as would have secured an engagement in a Wild West show. I escaped with 6 bullet holes through my clothing, but not a scratch except as made by brush and briar. The men wisely deemed discretion the better part of valor, and in company with their newly found escorts, started for that goal of their ambition, Petersburg. The Union troops made their way to the southern return of the earthworks, where their battle lines still held. Winfield Scott Hancock worked tirelessly to rally his men to withstand another thrust by the Confederates. Matthew Murphy's brigade moved out to reclaim some of their works, but were stopped by the fire of Weisiger and McGowan's troops. Some of the New Yorkers went into the railroad cut. Being prone in the cut, Weisiger's men threw cross ties and rails over the embankment onto the heads of the Yankees. Murphy's men pulled back from their failed attack. Irate at the state of his corps and being thrown back from his position along the railroad, Hancock ordered John Gibbon, one of his division commanders, to retake the works. Gibbon didn't realign his troops, but instead sent them forward toward the northern return of the captured earthworks. Inflating fire from the Union left halted the Union brigades, but Smith's brigade, at least part of it, secured a hold on the earthworks, led personally by Hancock. With a hold on the entrenchments, Hancock could now work on reclaiming more ground lost to Heath and Wilcox. Hancock ordered Colonel James Lynch and William Stedman to push against the rebels, still occupying the northern return. They did so and pushed all the way to the Phillips House, but Alfred Scales' brigade halted them, delivering some well-placed volleys into their ranks and forcing them back. Hancock wasn't giving up on Gibbon's troops just yet. He was aside on the battlefield with his hat in his hand, his sleeves loosened, and his horse's reins in his hands, split in two by a Confederate bullet. He urged his men to retake the ground. One soldier commented he looked more like a wild man or a soldier possessed with a restless demonic spirit than a general commanding in a good cause. He yelled to his troops, "Come on, we can beat them yet. Don't leave me, for God's sake." About then a bullet hit his horse in the neck. The animal fell forward, forcing Hancock to dismount. Quickly the horse recovered, and Hancock remounted. He went up to a staff officer and said, "Colonel, I do not care to die, but I pray God I may never leave this field." Hancock then heard musketry coming from the south. Wade Hampton's cavalry attacked the Union line, still holding on to the southern return of the works. This drove the Federals to the other side of the works. A soldier named Private Robert Stewart of the 140th Pennsylvania had recovered sufficiently enough from his Gettysburg wound to return to his unit, but not to the ranks. He recounts the chaos that he saw. The writer, who was on detached service in the Adjutant General's office of the division at this time, was seated on a log at the temporary headquarters, preparing a report, which had been ordered from the several brigades, when this fusillade broke out from the rear. With the line breaking up in our front and a force of the enemy of unknown strength directly in our rear, it seemed for a few moments as if we were all in a fair way to be escorted directly to Richmond. It was a position in which, for the time, there was no rear and no place which was not swept by artillery fire or musketry or both. The punishment was too great for the Second Corps, and they broke and ran, heading east toward the Jerusalem Plank Road. One of Hancock's staff members recalled Hancock had never before had the mortification of seeing them driven and his lines and guns taken, as on this occasion, and never before had he seen his men fail to respond to the utmost when he called upon them personally for a supreme effort, nor had he ever before ridden toward the enemy, followed by a beggarly army of a few hundred stragglers who had been gathered together and pushed toward the enemy. The agony of that day never passed away from that proud soldier. Hancock partly blamed Gibbon for the debacle, and he held animosity toward Meade for not sending him reinforcements directly from Globe Tavern. But as with any battle, there is plenty of blame to go around. The Union lost 2,700 and 47 soldiers, with over 2,000 of them being taken prisoner. The Confederacy lost 814 men. The disaster for the Union at the Second Battle of Reams Station illuminated some of the weaknesses in the Army of the Potomac. Its veterans were worn out from excessive marching and fighting, and the addition of green troops into those ranks made for a disastrous combination. It also exposed the weakness of the Union line as it attempted to swing around and cut off the rail lines running into Petersburg. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you.